Rolling Stone, May 15th, 2018, by Alan Feurer. Antifa on trial. How a college professor joined the left's radical ranks. Eric Clanton took to the streets with anti-fascists during a season of violence in Berkeley, and may spend the next decade in prison. Shortly after Donald Trump took office, the college town of Berkeley, California found itself at war. 3 violent protests broke out within the city within 3 months of Trump's inauguration. In early February, a riot emerged at its famously liberal university as masked anti-fascists from the movement known as ANTIFA attacked the Student Union Center and stopped the alt-right agitator Milo Yiannopoulos from delivering a speech. 4 weeks later, a second group of anti-fascists descended on a local public park, coming to blows with a raucous gathering of the president's supporters. It seemed at the time that Berkeley had again become what it hadn't been in more than 50 years, a battlefield for radicals. But the third event, Patriots' Day, a free speech rally planned for April 15th by a broad array of far-right groups, was poised to be the biggest battle yet. Protesters from both sides showed up early that day, slowly filling Martin Luther King Jr. Civic Center Park, a landmarked Greens ward in the middle of the city. The police had cut the park in half with a barrier of orange plastic mesh. The left-wing demonstrators made their way to one side, the right wing to the other. Kept at bay by riot cops, most of the participants were passionate but peaceful. Skipping ahead a little bit. Early in the fray, a group of Antifa combatants clad in ninja black had ducked into no man's land and pepper-sprayed an alt-right partisan in Roman-era gladiator helmet. That set off a series of aggressive scrapes between Antifa fascists and some members of the Rise Above movement, a group of white supremacists who had shown up wearing skull masks. For the next few hours, as marchers waved signs, the militants in the crowd scuffled at its edges in probing skirmishes. But at 3 p.m., there was an explosion deep in right-wing territory. Some would later say it was an Antifa M80, and the skirmishes erupted into a brawl. The men from the Rise Above charged across the Antifa front line. People were body slammed, punched in the face, kicked in the gut. Tear gas filled the air, and the park became a swirling sea of fists and sticks and pipes. As a helicopter shuddered overhead, the park's perimeter gave way, and a conflagration spilled into the streets. Unable to contain the melee, the police withdrew, and a 3x4 block section of the city was consumed by open war. Here it's looking to me like Rolling Stone is trying to throw all these events into a blender and then make the bike lock attack look like self-defense. And the next line here. Amid the chaos is a brief but brutal scene of violence. Out in the street, a young anti-fascist dressed in a hoodie, his face obscured by a bandana, swung what seemed to be a large metal bike lock squarely onto the skull of an unwitting alt-right demonstrator. The victim was a 20-year-old college student, Sean Stiles, who had made the trip to Berkeley from his home in Santa Cruz. Though Stiles had been consorting with the men from Rise Above. Really? Is that proven? The bike lock attack was unprovoked. Stiles had been arguing with 2 young leftist women about illegal immigration when he was hit. He simply put out his hands on his head, which started gushing blood, and stumbled off as the assailant disappeared. Reached by Rolling Stone, Stiles had no comment on the attack, which is probably wise on his part. According to the Berkeley police, Stiles was one of 11 people injured at the rally. There had also been 20 arrests, but the man with the lock was not among them. The bike lock attack seemed at first like a footnote to the city's season-long experience with violence. In the days that followed, the media focused on the broad themes of the protest. A little American Civil War, as the Daily Beast called it, but appeared less interested in the details of the fighting. Many reporters were also unaware that even after the Civic Center Park returned to normal, a clandestine battle triggered by the conflict had continued online. Driving that campaign was Poe, the politically incorrect chat board on 4chan. As soon as the protest ended, the trolls and hackers who used the site launched a fevered search for Styles' assailant, a suspect they took to calling Bike Lock Guy. From the moment it was formed in 2011, Pole had been a breeding ground for some of the right's most virulent movements, an online swamp for everyone from gamer gators and men's right activists to overt racists and white supremacists. Now its digital sleuths were poring over videos for clues about Bike Lock Guy, eagerly swapping tips with one another. Look into the Oak Roots anarchist group in Oakland, one wrote, of a lead that turned out to be false. You will find him. By April 17th, 2 days after the battle in the park, the 4chaners had compiled a list of Bike Lock Guy identifiables. The manlet they were looking for was 5 feet 6 or so, slimly built, and had worn a hoodie, dark jeans, and black gloves, a black backpack, and knockoff Ray-Ban sunglasses. When one poll user theorized that given his footwork, the suspect might belong to martial arts or boxing gym, another posted a list of local facilities. When the hackers ran the evidence that they had, partial photographs of Bike Lock Guy's unmasked eyebrows and nasolabial angle, through an image search, it came back with a hit. A 28-year-old Bay Area college professor named Eric Clanton. Clanton was a perfect target for Pole. He was not just a professor, but an ethics professor who taught philosophy and critical thinking at Diablo Valley College in the East Bay suburb of Pleasant Hill. In a detail that provoked the chatboard's sardonic ire, his work encompassed restorative justice from an anti-authoritarian perspective. Once Pole had found Clanton's name, its hackers found his OkCupid account, discovering that he had described himself to his suitors as a gender non-conforming sapiosexual, interested in helping to precipitate the end of civil society. They also published the home phone numbers and addresses of some of his closest relatives. Poor little terrorist snowflake, one 4chaner wrote, about to get melted. But Pole was not content to sit on the scoop. On April 20th, Milo Yiannopoulos broke a bombshell story on his website. Topped by photographs of Clanton, the site announced that the internet had identified the Antifa rioter who weaponized a giant bike lock. One day after the story ran, the Berkeley Police Department got an email from the Alameda County Sheriff Office. It had been sent to the Sheriff's Anonymous public tip line. Recently, the email read, there has been an individual assaulting people with a U-lock at various rallies and events in California. After an extensive investigation, a group of concerned citizens has identified the suspect as Eric Clanton. Attached to the email were a half-dozen video clips of right-wing marchers on Patriots' Day, being clubbed with a bike lock by a young man in a hoodie, black pants, black gloves, and a black backpack. Though the Berkeley police had no idea who had sent the trove of evidence, they seemed to have taken it seriously. Within 2 days, detectives had obtained a photograph of Clanton from the state DMV. According to the investigative documents, the photo showed that Clanton's nose, jaw, hairline, and facial hair were at least similar to those of the bike lock attacker. The police began surveillance on Clanton's house in San Leandro, a couple miles south of Oakland. They also started tracking his cell phone and determined from a mapping program that he'd connected twice to a cellular tower 2 blocks north of Civic Center Park on the day of the attacks. On May 24th, the cops used Clanton's phone to locate him at a large communal house in Oakland. A strike team broke into the house and found Clanton standing in the middle of an upstairs bedroom. When they searched the room, they found a canister of bear spray, 2 flip knives, metal knuckles, Ray-Ban sunglasses, and a Tupperware of psilocybin mushrooms. They also discovered a billy club stashed inside Clanton's car. By 3 p.m., Clanton was in custody at Berkeley Police Headquarters. 2 detectives sat him down in an interview room. After they Mirandized the suspect, the first detective asked a question. Why? There was no response, so the second took a shot. Why, he said, did Mr. Clanton do what he did? The roots of Antifa arguably stretch back decades to the communist street gangs in Europe that battled fascists when they first emerged in the 1920s and 30s. Almost a century later, the movement is again making headlines. Since Trump first stepped into the presidential race, Antifa's frontline fighters have been engaged in near constant conflict. They have sparred with skinheads in California, punched a neo-Nazi at Trump's inauguration, shut down speeches by xenophobic ideologues, and fought against the preservation of Confederate-era statues. Almost from the start, the right has demonized Antifa followers as cartoon villains. The left, meanwhile, has split over the movement and its use of violent tactics. As white supremacists and proto-fascists have re-emerged across the culture, many progressives have embraced Antifa's cause, though others remain wary of its an eye for an eye approach, concerned that it could merely serve to inflame right-wing extremism. After the violence in Charlottesville last summer, House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi said Antifa's militants should be prosecuted. Others, like the scholar Cornel West, praised them as heroes. When I flew to California to speak with Clanton 3 months after his arrest, he told me he had granted the interview only because he'd already been outed by the criminal justice system. Even as Antifa has attracted more attention under Trump, it remains a source of mystery to many. Cloaked in a shroud of secrecy, its followers seem eager to sustain. Unlike the far right, which despises but often engages with the press, Antifa activists tend to shun reporters. For security reasons, they avoid revealing their identities, mask themselves during illicit operations, and typically communicate through encrypted chat apps like Signal. A lot of anti-fascists don't expect much from the mainstream of society, says Daryl Jenkins, a self-described member of the movement, who has been involved in protests for nearly 30 years. The reason is, the mainstream should have stopped a lot of what's been happening before it took root, and it didn't. I met Clanton in a conference room at his lawyer's office in Oakland. Though he had been charged with felony assault, there was no outward sign of the violence that the bike lock attacker had evidenced on video. A slim young man with watchful eyes and wavy blonde surfer's hair, Clanton seemed instead like a distracted academic. In his blue jeans and preppy sweater, he was pensive, full of halting pauses, and obviously frightened by the possible 11-year sentence he was facing. Clanton is scheduled to be in court next month for a hearing that could decide whether he pleads guilty to a lesser charge or goes to trial. This lesser charge shit is bullshit. It happens way too often. How can you possibly receive a lesser charge than the crime that you're on video committing? And this just shows more corruption in the California legal system, and really judges as a whole who think they're above the legal system, who can look at the Constitution that says the president has a right to decide who comes and who goes from the country, or at least who comes into the country. The judge says, no, I'm gonna deny that right, which is clearly written down in the law. Or the judge who blocks 3D printed guns are clearly under the Second Amendment. The First Amendment, I mean, they didn't have serial numbers on the muskets you guys are always talking about, but he immediately told me there are things he wouldn't talk about. Antifa's tactics, its hangouts in the Bay, any specific groups or individuals. He was also adamant that he not be represented as a spokesman for a movement that has none. Antifa is not a cohesive group with a top-down leadership. It is structured horizontally, with autonomous local cells that act independently in cities across the country. While there is often cooperation among its chapters, there is no central Antifa authority. To me, it's like an expensive circle of friend groups, Clanton says, adding that the movement is composed of friends and friends of friends and friends of friends of friends. In the United States, the movement's origins can be traced back to the 1970s and 1980s when neo-Nazi skinheads started making inroads on the punk scene. In response, leftist punks formed a loose resistance known as Anti-Racist Action, which shut down their rivals' gatherings and music shows using the slogan, "Never let the Nazis have the streets." The current Antifa movement has borrowed tactics from the anti-globalization protests of the late 1990s, in which black blocs of fighters wearing balaclavas marched against international finance groups like the WTO. Antifa's egalitarianism and consensus-based governance largely derive from the Occupy phenomena. More recently, in an effort to fight institutional racism, a kind of proto-Antifa joined forces with Black Lives Matter in its serial protests against police brutality. All of these strands, anti-racism, anti-capitalism, anti-authoritarianism, have come together in the struggle against Trump. Drawn from a diverse array of backgrounds, labor unions, anarchist clubs, communist and socialist political parties, the groups of radical leftists that have aligned themselves with Antifa's ideals have come to the conclusion that the president and the extremists who have flocked to him present the closest thing to a fascist threat the country has seen in decades. I hate to mention the actual historic Nazis, because of America's unique relationship to white supremacy, but I'm going to, Clanton says. It took a decade or so for the sort of social and political situation in Germany to normalize anti-Semitism, such that it was viable for things to happen the way they did. And I think that the alt-right building power in the streets is the sort of beginning for the same sort of normalization. I heard the same from every follower of Antifa I spoke to, and an echo of 1933, a virulent strain of nativism, is ascending to the West as political leaders from Warsaw to Washington have sought to reorient state power toward white populations and blame the failures of the economic system on refugees and immigrants. Fascism is re-emerging, and there are structural reasons for it, says George Ciccariello-Maher.
Around it. You were in the right calling for a white genocide, were you, George? Is that the case? Do you think you need to commit suicide, or is it that you're not white now because you're a Jew?
A political scientist at the Hemispheric Institute in New York who counts himself as both a scholar and an adherent of Antifa. So it is no accident that we see the reemergence of those willing to fight fascism. Beyond street fighting, Antifa members also write exposés on the methods and movements of far-right leaders, host anti-fascist conferences and workshops, and tout ideals about fostering sustainable, peaceful communities, tending neighborhood gardens, and setting up booths at book fairs and film festivals, with literature on everything from Native American society to Sacco and Vanzetti. Right, I can just imagine them all there at the, all of them out there at the farmer's market in their black masks, hiding their identities from the scary alt-righters, right, that are just hunting down all the left-wingers wherever they are. We all know the rash of book fairs and neighborhood gardens coming under attack by right-wing activists. In fact, Antifa spend 98% of their time helping old ladies cross the street, rescuing cats from trees. They wear the masks in case they ever need to rush into a fire to rescue babies. But their chief means of beating back the neo-fascist threat is direct action, the tactical term for using force to deny extremists a platform from which to spread their rhetoric. You can't reason with fascism. It's irrational, Ciccariello-Maher says. You can't argue your way around it, you just have to stop it. People come to Antifa through different channels. Clanton's channel is academics. Raised in a stable family in Bakersfield, one of California's most conservative cities, which explains why he had a stable family. He studied at Bakersfield Christian, an evangelical high school. He says he felt like an oddball there, and struggled to find a voice for his out-of-step beliefs, which he described as an embryonic anti-state communism. Even when he went to college at Cal State Bakersfield, few of his fellow students were interested in his budding notions about capital and race. That's funny because these days it's Eric Clanton who doesn't want to have a conversation about capital and race. He remembers feeling a sense of isolation as he watched a live stream of the cops in New York City raiding Zuccotti Park during Occupy Wall Street. It was only when he left for grad school in 2013, heading off to San Francisco State, that he finally found a language for his politics. He started reading anarchist zines and theorists like Enrico Malatesta, in between attending seminars on the prison system. Far more alluring than his classwork, though, was the Bay Area's robust community of activists and organizers. Clanton started spending time in Oakland, the nation's riot capital, where queer folk, militants of color, Marxist academics, and tech bro-hating anarchists. Sounds like a bunch of fucking freaks and weirdos, doesn't it? Tech bro-hating anarchists. For fuck's sakes, it's not even a thing. Get a fucking real hobby. We're protesting Google buses and mass incarceration. I felt like my politics had a home, Clanton says. I wasn't alone in what I thought about the world. Oakland's radicals were particularly focused on police brutality, and Clanton's first taste of violent protest came that summer after George Zimmerman was acquitted in Florida of killing Trayvon Martin. Clanton tagged along, merely watching, he insists, as a swarming crowd took to Oakland streets, smashing windows, blocking freeways, and occasionally fighting the police. Within a year, he had reached a deeper level of engagement. In November 2014, a grand jury declined to indict the cop who killed Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and this time, Clanton joined the angry mob that flooded downtown Oakland, with some in the crowd rioting and looting for nearly 2 weeks. Soon after, Clanton took part in another massive protest when Daniel Pantaleo, the officer who killed Eric Garner in New York, escaped prosecution. Running with a throng that shut down trains and freeways, Clanton was arrested for the first time in his life, charged with public nuisance and willful obstruction of movement in a public place. Marching against the police directed Clanton's energies against white supremacy. When he shut down the trains and freeways, actually we did see that with BLM, so I guess that's confirmed by the professors that freeways are a form of white supremacy. Marching against the police directed Clanton's energies against white supremacy and what he described as structural violence of the states. So yeah, it's a structure, roads, buildings for sure, especially Starbucks and Google, you know, the kind of places these people protest. Which explains why he had a stable family. The protests also proved that, with sufficient motivation, radicals could oppose even the most entrenched forms of authority. See, this is the result, and every reasonable person knows you're going to get this result. When the police allow this, they don't intervene, they don't seize weapons, they don't break things up, it becomes permissive. And this is exactly what happens here. Eric Clanton becomes radicalized. He becomes a terrorist because of the permissive attitude of the authorities. This is something the counterterrorism experts of today should take into account. See, we're dealing with prison abolitionists, and at the top, like Eric Clanton or Rolling Stone magazine, they aren't just soft-hearted, they actually do not want criminals to be in prison. Before I saw those things happen, Clanton said, I had this very docile academic sense of what I believed to be wrong with the world and no real sense of power to do something about it. But after, he adds, he realized that he had been part of a force of people who were going to hold the street and that weren't going to back down easily. It was, I think, the first time that I believed that people had a power sufficient to challenge the state. In the wake of his arrest, Clanton took a break. Burned out on politics, he returned to his studies, working on a master's thesis about the roots of human ethics, in what he called a mutual education, communism. He also took a job as a volunteer instructor at San Quentin State Prison, teaching Emma Goldman and Angela Davis to the inmates. I know Angela Davis is a prison abolitionist with ties to the left-wing terrorist group, the Weather Underground, that Bill Clinton pardoned on his final day in office, or pardoned some members of, who were involved in murders, actual murders, and Bill Aird, look him up, there's a whole pathway I could go down there. That's not the focus of this video. The whole concept of mutual education is stupid. Isn't that what people were complaining about when George Bush introduced that No Child Left Behind? I mean, you can't train everybody to be a surgeon. The mind is just another means of production that communism needs to seize. But then in June 2015, something brought him off the sidelines. Donald Trump rode a gold escalator into one of the strangest and most overtly racist political campaigns in recent memory. Trump was the embodiment of everything that Clanton had been fighting. A law and order billionaire who vowed to use the full force of the government to redress white grievance. Clanton told me that when he heard the candidate talk about his Muslim ban or his plans to wall off Mexico, build a wall around Mexico, that was Trump's campaign goal. Over Mexico, in fact. Build a wall, just dome off Mexico. That'll be his 2020 campaign promise. Build a dome over Mexico. Keep the sunlight out. His instinctive reaction was, fuck Donald Trump, and I'm sure he never heard it from the media. But Trump was only part of the problem. A few months into the campaign, Clanton started noticing recruiting posters for Identity Europa, a California-based neo-Nazi group that would later fight in Berkeley on both the UC and Diablo Valley campuses. Was that who those girls were? They were Identity Europa? Well, I guess that makes it okay for a bunch of grown men to club them over the head with sticks. And so I guess Clanton was there at the event. Well, that's pretty interesting. I don't think there's a statute of limitations run out on that one yet for a fellow who got clubbed. Around the same time, Trump was having trouble disavowing David Duke, a former Grand Wizard in the Ku Klux Klan, and 3 protesters were stabbed at a violent clown rally in Anaheim. When they were attacked. Things were getting worse, but Clanton says the situation did not seem ripe enough for action yet. At that point, he explains, we weren't seeing right-wing guys with sticks and bats coming into our neighborhoods. Yeah, they still had the sticks and bats. They were still the ones coming into the neighborhood. In fact, I think they still are. I've never seen right-wing guys go anywhere to anybody else's event to confront them. I don't know, maybe there's 1 or 2 examples. I can't think of them, but if there are, it's dwarfed by Antifa. I mean, that's their hobby. They don't have their own events. They in fact don't stand for anything. They don't fight for anything except for the destruction of everything else. The destruction of order, law and order. That's what Clanton hates. That's what he's fighting. In fact, most of the violence then was taking place at Trump campaign events. This is true, but not the way they state this. At a gathering in Miami, one of Trump's followers shoved and kicked a Latino protester, and another, a black man, was sucker punched by a Trump supporter in North Carolina. And yeah, to be fair, that was a sucker punch by one guy in an entire stadium. It's not like the stadium turned on him, started ripping him to pieces in a mass mob like you guys tried to do in San Jose. Or so many other numerous examples that I don't have time to point out all of, because it would literally take hours. Well, my video editor keeps crashing every 2 or 3 minutes, and there's still a ways to go in this article, so it looks like it's getting a part 2. If you've got something to say about this story, more information to add, please leave it in the comments section. It'll probably make it into the next video.